Today, I have the pleasure to welcome not only our participants, but also our guest speaker and keynote lecturer, Éric Fassin, for our module on discursive practices of soft authoritarianism. And in this module, we will focus on the manifold ways public discourse is manipulated and transformed in many democratic countries, as well as on the effects this has on policies, legislation, and more generally on democracy as such. And for that, I have the great pleasure to welcome Éric Fassin. And Éric Fassin is a professor of sociology at Paris VIII, Vincennes, Saint-Denis, which is a university in the north of Paris, which is famous for its revolutionary history and emancipatory spirit, which is born out of the student revolts in 1968. And actually our two respective institutes collaborated in a project with the Kurdish University in Rojava, famously also led by Ulrike Vlader and other professors of our institute. But Éric Fassin is part of the Political Science and Gender Studies department at Paris VIII. He's also affiliated with the Research Center on Gender and Sexuality Studies of the National Center of Scientific Research of France, and a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France, which is the national body to further excellent research. And in his research, Éric addresses gender and sexual politics, hence also his notion sexual democracy, which I find very intriguing, and I would actually love to discuss further today, if possible. But he also touches on immigration, national identity, and the growing significance of race in France, as well as academic freedom, which has become attacked in many democratic countries, also in France. And among his many publications, I only want to mention a few that I think are most relevant for our topic today. For one, the 2006 edited volume, De la question sociale à la question raciale, which he co-edited with his brother Didier Fassin, and which points at internal contradictions of French Republican universalism when confronted with systemic exclusions like racism. Then his 2012 monography, Démocratie précaire, which is a chronicle of the unreason of the state between 2006 and 2012. And an essay called Populisme et le grand ressentiment from 2017, where he asked the question if a left populism is needed in order to fight neoliberalism. And he actually criticizes this notion of left populism by La Clown Move, and says that before constructing a people, we should construct a left. And as we have seen in the articles and interviews that Éric sent around, he has a very clear analysis of the moment we live in, which he describes as a neo-fascist moment of neoliberalism, as well as an intersectional moment in time. And I, for one, am very curious to learn about that more and to discuss with him. And with that, I hand over to you, Éric, and I'm very curious and excited to hear you talk about this topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hagen, and thank you everyone for joining this morning, even though you might want to have a quiet weekend. So I appreciate the effort and hope that you will find it worthwhile. I'm very glad to participate in this event. I think we need international conversations on these issues, as the topics that we're talking about are not just national issues. There's a tendency to focus, because we're involved very often within our own countries, to focus on what's happening in our own countries. Conversely, there may be a tendency at times to do just the opposite, that is to globalize I think we have to do both. That is to pay attention to what is going on locally and to what is going on internationally. The international circulation is very much part of what we're doing, but if we're talking about international, that means that national matters as well. We'll see that in the discussion. And of course, I heard what Hagen said, and I'll be very happy in the discussion to talk not only about what I'm going to say now, but about anything you're interested in, provided that I have anything to say that is worth saying, which is, of course, debatable and depends, etc. Let me start with the phrase soft authoritarianism. I think it's interesting for me because Hagen just mentioned the short essay that I wrote on populism, and my main idea was that talking about populism was misleading because it conflated, or rather suggested that there was a common denominator between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And if you start saying that, of course, you end up saying that the bottom line, and that's what Chantal Mouffe ended up saying, there's a sort of a democratic core in this. And so there's something in common between the far right and the left. Now, I very much oppose that. But at times, I think it is useful to put together different situations. So whereas I oppose conflating left-wing and right-wing populism, and therefore I don't talk about left-wing populism. But I think talking about soft authoritarianism is a good way to think that in fact it does have something to do with the more open, blatant, hard forms of authoritarianism. And I say this as one who lives in France, and I think, of course, I speak from that context. People, I imagine, usually do not associate France with neo-fascism, or at least not in the present. In many ways, we have had a president, Emmanuel Macron, who has presented himself as a response to neo-fascism, both nationally, in his opposition to Marine Le Pen and the National Rally, formerly National Front, and internationally, for example, in his opposition to Salvini when he was in government, and etc. So it is tempting to think that France and other countries don't belong with, say, Hungary or Turkey or Brazil. What I want to emphasize is the continuity, the continuum between different forms of authoritarian regimes. If we take the example of France, as you may know, despite the proclamations of democracy, in the name of the Republic that are constant, we've had, for example, repression against not just migrants, and we've had that at the border. We've had that at the Italian border, for example, but we also had that in Calais, etc. But we also have repression against demonstrations. So, in fact, there has been a transformation of what was allegedly a liberal regime, a neoliberal regime that has transformed into a neoliberal, illiberal regime in many ways. The authoritarian dimension is displayed these days, for example, in the use of an article in the Constitution that makes it possible to pass laws without any vote. And of course, that's not entirely new, but all of these indicate that in fact, the clear-cut opposition between authoritarian and liberal is crumbling at best and perhaps falling apart. I think there's a mic, or perhaps it's mine, I don't know. That's open. So I do start from France. that is from a context that is paradoxically authoritarian. And that's why I find the term soft authoritarianism useful, precisely because it forces us to consider what there is in common between regimes that are supposed to be the opposite. Of course, when exchanged with people in Brazil, because Bolsonaro has played so much against Macron and his wife, etc., people feel that France is a liberal country compared to Bolsonaro. I want to emphasize the opposite side of the story. I will not focus just on France, of course, but I will not lose track of France as an archetypal example of how liberal regimes can become illiberal. Now, let me start precisely here. I think the context of France is relevant with campaigns against the ideology of gender and what has been called in France the theory of gender. Now, I think this is interesting first because it's not specific to France. We have seen how these campaigns have spread throughout the world, but I very much believe that France was a sort of laboratory for such attacks starting in 2010-11. And of course, I'm not sort of taking pride in France being a pioneer in anti-gender attacks, but I think it's important to see how it came about. Now, what is the argument against gender as a concept, as a field of studies? First, this is what I want to point out, and the French phrase theory of gender makes it very visible. It's not just the traditional sexually conservative position. It's not just about abortion, for example, or contraception. It's about gender studies as well. That is, the movement against gender is not just the old thing, it's also a new thing. It's combining a critique of feminism and a critique of gender studies, a critique of LGBT movements, but also a critique of queer studies. Now, this, I think, is important because I think the bottom line of what is going on, and I will say more about this when we talk about race in a few minutes, is this convergence of two rhetorics, the traditionally conservative and the anti-intellectual logic. Anti-intellectualism, I think, is a key to what is going on now. And that's why I take seriously issues of language, issues of representation, issues of rhetoric, because indeed, anti-intellectualism, I think, is central. And of course, and I will return to that, it is central for us who do intellectual work. And not just because we're targets, but also because we have to take seriously what intellectual representations, intellectual rhetorics imply. Now, what is the logic behind these attacks against gender? What we see is that it's very often in the name of common sense. Common sense as opposed to complicated theories. That's why I insist on the word theory. It's no accident that Judith Butler has been taken as a primary target. As you know, for example, she was burnt in effigy in São Paulo in Brazil a few years ago. And constantly she's being attacked. Why? Of course, because of her importance, prominence in the field, but not just that. I think it's also because she represents a kind of highly theoretical approach. And it's because it's supposed to be so intellectual. And in part, of course, as has been pointed out many times, it has to do with anti-Semitism as well. That is the idea of this sophisticated intellectual whom people cannot understand. That is the common sense of the people versus the pretentiousness of intellectuals who do theoretical work is part of this. Now, of course, common sense is not the only element. People can, in certain contexts, in a traditionally conservative context, invoke God as an authority that defines the sexual order, or nature. in a more up-to-date version. It's in this context that I have talked about sexual democracy, as Hagen mentioned. I believe that the reason why there is so much struggle about sexual issues these days has to do with what I call sexual democracy, which has to do in the end with democracy. And I will return to that. What do I mean by sexual democracy? Quite simply, it's the idea that we live more and more in a world where the sexual order is explicitly for everyone a political issue. That is, even those who dislike this politicization of the sexual order, for example, the Vatican, they still have to intervene and to make statements to say, this is what marriage is about, or this is what a man is, or a woman, etc. So in fact, even those who oppose sexual democracy have to enter the discussion, the debate. They have to say something about the sexual order. And indeed, as we know, the Vatican has been making many pronouncements about the sexual order, including talking about gender. That is, in many ways, the Pope has had to engage in a discussion with Judith Butler. Now, that I think is quite remarkable, and it says something about what I call sexual democracy. Sexual democracy is premised on a definition of democracy that says we live in societies that claim to define the world that we live in, which means the definition of the social order, and in this case of the sexual order, is not given from above. It's not something that pre-exists our world. It's something that we decide. Of course, the question of who is we is very much what politics is about. Who's left out of the we for defining the sexual order? But that's precisely what all the battles have been about. Whom do we leave out? Whom do we take in this definition of the social order and of the sexual order? But what it means is that it's not given once and for all. It's all historical, it's all political, it's for us to define in an immanent logic. Those who oppose this, who oppose sexual democracy, who claim a transcendent definition of the world, that is, that pre-exists us, that is above us, outside us, those who do that still have to fight. They have to engage in the battle to define the world. So my argument is that it's no accident that we have all these battles about the sexual order. It has to do with the fact that the sexual order is the ultimate limit. Why? Because it's quite easy to accept that immigration policies or tax policies are defined by us. But many people will say, yes, but there are things that don't depend on us, that are outside of us, such as the definition of marriage, which is what many people have argued, or the definition of what is a man, what is a woman. So I think the battle about sex is really the ultimate boundary, the ultimate frontier, rather, of the democratic logic. This is why the battle is taking place there, because if even who's a man, who's a woman, what is marriage, what is the family, if even that is up to us, then everything is. And I think that's why there's so much resistance on the part of conservatives. Now, it's not just about gender. And I have insisted from the start on the importance of anti-intellectualism, but I want now to take a second example, which is race. And of course, you can see immediately why the sexual order and the racial order have something in common. Both can easily be naturalized because it works through the body. It's how we look, how we're supposed to appear. And so this naturalization of the social order, of hierarchies, etc., is what is at stake, not just in battles about gender, but also in battles about race. Now, let me point out that, of course, again, the idea that conservatives or reactionaries or authoritarian regimes and parties should oppose racial equality is not new. Clearly, just like for gender, the idea that people should oppose reproductive rights for women or etc., that's not new. What is relatively new is the insistence not just on race, but on race as a concept. Just like for gender, it's not just the sexual order, but it's gender as a concept, as a field of studies. In the same way, as you know, for example, in the US, there has been considerable importance of attacks against so-called critical race theory. And we find the same word, theory. And a man who has played a major role in promoting these campaigns made it clear in a New Yorker interview that, in fact, he was really very happy with the term critical race theory because it's the best way to mobilize conservatives, because it sounds pompous, because it doesn't sound like what common sense would say. It's not the people, it's elites, intellectual elites. This anti-elitism is, of course, anti-intellectualism. So in the case of France, what we have is all these complicated words that have entered the common vocabulary. For example, we have the president who started attacking in 2020 intersectionality. Now, what is interesting is that apart from those of us who work in this field, 5 years ago, no one in France knew the word intersectionality. I mean, activists, etc. But I mean, it was something that was not part of the common vocabulary. In the same way, before all these attacks against the theory of gender, most people had not heard of gender. So I always claim that those of us who work in gender studies owe a great deal to the Vatican in terms of recognition. But I think in France, those of us who work on the field of critical race theory, if we want to call it like that, or any other term that we're going to use, owe a great deal to Emmanuel Macron and to his government. In fact, we've seen ministers who have kept using these words, trying to talk about racisé, which is a term that defines people who are defined racially, i.e. non-whites, to put it simply. It's interesting that they don't quite know how to use it. They hesitate on the word, but still they introduce these words. And they've started talking about post-colonial studies, but of course they don't quite know how to call it. And also it's partly bad faith. And they talk about post-colonialism as if it were an ideology and not a field of studies. Same with decoloniality, which becomes decolonialism, etc. So the introduction of these words that no one knew, I mean, and again, I exaggerate when I say no one, of course, but that most people didn't know. The introduction of these terms just shows people that there are complicated things going on in the university, that people are out of touch with reality. And that's where it has to do with what has been described as a kind of populism, and which I would rather call neo-fascism. That is the idea that the real people don't care about all this intellectual, theoretical stuff, that reality is not something that has to do with intelligence, that we don't need to understand the world. And this is something that has been going on for quite a few years in France. We've had President Sarkozy, starting in the mid-2000s, who attacked the social sciences, in particular insisting on the fact that explaining is justifying, which means that if you explain terrorism, you're an accomplice of terrorism. If you explain unrest in the banlieue, that is in the working class, largely non-white suburbs of cities like Paris, you're complicit with the violence that can erupt. Or if you're talking about Islam, or rather Islamophobia, then you're complicit with Islamic terrorists, etc. He was not the only one, because we also had Manuel Valls, who was supposedly a socialist. And when he was Minister of the Interior and then Prime Minister, he picked up the very same idea, that is, explaining is justifying, which means that intellectual work is dangerous for society, that it's really a problem. Now, I think there's something interesting in my perspective if we start comparing the attacks on gender and the attacks on race, that is, on the concept of gender or the field of gender studies, and attacks on race, that is critical race theory in the field of working on race, etc. In both cases, I believe that the reason we're attacked is not just as a kind, and I say we as I have been one of the targets of these attacks for years, but of course not the only one, but I include myself in the picture as I cannot avoid doing that. What I think is interesting is that there is a link that is made very explicitly between theoretical work, which is presented as irrelevant, as out of touch with reality, and paradoxically, with social movements. That is, for example, in June 2020, when Macron launched his campaign by attacking academics who split the Republic into two pieces that divide the nation. And this was picked up by his Minister of Education a few months later, who attacked Islamo-leftists, that is the term that developed, saying that they were complicit with terrorism. This was a few days after a teacher, Samuel Paty, was decapitated. And it was also a few days after I was threatened with decapitation for my work. So they all basically say that there's a link between intellectual work and what is going on in society. The moment when Macron started his attack was the moment when there were mobilizations in the streets after the first lockdown, with the movement led by Assa Traoré in defense of her brother who had been killed in the hands of the police. So this surge of anti-racism is directly associated by the president with people who work on race. Now, this is not entirely absurd. For example, I was called as a witness in the trial of Assa Traoré by her lawyers. And so it's not absurd to make a connection, but I think it's something that we've had a hard time accepting, because in many ways, we have accepted anti-intellectualism. That is, we tend to think that what we do doesn't really matter. And that's one of the lines of defense that has been used by many people, saying, no, don't accuse us of undoing the social order, because in fact, what we're doing is not really that important. Well, I think I don't want to overestimate, and I don't want to say that we're the cause of these changes, but we're part of these changes. And in fact, what I see is that students are also activists. And so what they learn in academia is something that they can use outside of academia, that these are not two separate worlds. And in fact, there's more and more in activism a way of using theoretical material, theoretical references. And so I think we should not exaggerate this, but we should not underestimate this. That is, activists think, activists read. Conversely, academics sometimes work with activists. So these are not separate worlds. And in fact, intellectual work has political relevance as reactionaries understand very well. So their attacks are not just distractions. There are ways of saying, yes, something is changing. This is clear in the case of race. There's a whole new vocabulary that has developed in France, but not just in France. There are social movements, such as Black Lives Matter, which has spread internationally. But it's also true about gender, and again, with social movements that have spread internationally, such as Me Too, etc. So I think we have to understand this anti-intellectual reaction as a symptom of the understanding by reactionaries that indeed social movements, that is the possibility of transforming society, has to do in part with intellectual work. There's a circulation between activism and intellectual work. And this will be one of my rare moments of optimism in this presentation, saying that basically we should not overestimate it, but what we do matters, just like the rest. But it matters too. It's not outside of the world. Let's not accept a sort of minimal anti-intellectualism that says that intellectual work doesn't matter. In fact, there's also today a very strong, powerful anti-intellectualism that says the opposite, that says that intellectual work matters. And this is something that I want to emphasize. These two meanings of anti-intellectualism. Intellectual work doesn't matter, or it does matter very much. Neoliberalism, in many ways, has to do with the first version of anti-intellectualism. That is, critical work is useless. We should be pragmatic. We need things that can be used directly for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So neoliberalism mobilizes anti-intellectualism by basically dismantling programs that are not directly useful and introducing an economic neoliberal logic in our work that makes it very difficult to maintain a critical posture. But at the same time, there's another kind of anti-intellectualism, which I would call neo-fascist anti-intellectualism, that says critical work is dangerous. And again, this was tested with gender. Many people have argued that, for example, introducing PACS, that is the first version of gay marriage in France at the end of the 1990s, this was the end of the world. And of course, they're partly right. That is, it's the end of the world as they knew it, as we knew it. The recognition of same-sex couples means that, of course, we change our definitions of the sexual order. Of course. So I think we should pay attention to both meanings of anti-intellectualism that have to do with the two forces that today sometimes work together. Of course, that's not always the case, but today neoliberalism and neo-fascism work together, and that's why you can have soft authoritarianism. That is, regimes such as that of France that are not supposedly neo-fascist, but that end up making objective alliances with neo-fascists, because in many ways, they don't just say critical work is useless, they also say it's dangerous. So they start with a neoliberal version and they end up with a neo-fascist version. That's what we have witnessed. And indeed, what was very striking is that the words used by Macron and his government were identical with those that had been used by Marion Maréchal, who's one of the leaders of the far right of the family of Jean-Marie Le Pen and of Marine Le Pen. Now, I want now to develop a bit more on how this rhetoric works. I have insisted on the anti-intellectualism. I have insisted on the link between intellectual critical work and social movements. I have insisted on the combination of different arguments in the rhetoric of reaction, to speak like Albert Hirschman, with the useless anti-intellectualism and the dangerous anti-intellectualism. I mean, anti-intellectualism based on the idea that critical work is useless or dangerous. But now I want to point out something that is perhaps not just reactionary, but that may be what defines neo-fascism today. And that, I think, has to do with language. Basically, I want to argue that one of the main elements in the rhetoric that is today used against not only critical thought, but also social movements. Sorry, thank you. One thing that I want to emphasize is the rhetoric of turning things upside down. And let me explain this. There's a long-standing tradition in France in the last 40 years, or 30 years rather, that is used by conservatives against minorities. Minorities are accused of undermining universalism, because they insist on specificity, they're supposed to be multiculturalist, and they're supposed to undo the republic. This conservative rhetoric has functioned very well as under the term communautarisme, which would be loosely translated as identity politics. And so the idea is that you have minorities that sort of dismantle our colorblind universalist model. And this has been used against women, this has been used against sexual minorities and against racial minorities, against religious minorities, etc. That basically, let's not talk about what is specific about you, because that would undermine the republic. Now, of course, the problem with this is that it reverses the reality of what is going on. It's not that minorities in France talk about being minorities, it's that they're denied certain rights. And so they talk about discrimination. So they don't talk about we the women, or we the gays, or we the racial minorities, etc. They talk about discrimination against these different groups. And so it's inseparable. So it is a universalist language. And this is something that I have argued for over 30 years, that in many ways, talking about minorities is talking about in universalist terms, because it's talking about the promise of equality and the promise of equality that is betrayed every day in the practice of our political regimes. Now, this way of turning things upside down, that is the conservative version, has been radicalized in the last few years. Let me take a second example. There's a word that has spread worldwide in the same way that universalism in France is very often defined as a specifically French feature, which of course is somewhat paradoxical, because universalism, if it is a national feature, that's a contradiction in terms. But the same has happened with the word laïcité. Laïcité, or secularism, is often presented in French as something that is fundamentally French and fundamentally universalist. Again, that's a contradiction in terms. What is interesting is that nationalizing laïcité, just like nationalizing universalism, has a consequence. It means that when you talk about laïcité, or when you talk about universalism, you can just reverse the meaning of the term. What is laïcité historically? It's religious freedom. What is laïcité today, when it is argued that it's essentially French? It's telling people what to do or not to do. So it's the opposite of religious freedom. For example, more and more people will tell you that there should be no religious signs in the public sphere, in the public space, in public spaces. Now, that's not exactly religious freedom. That's the opposite of religious freedom. What is interesting is that in many ways, if you start saying that, you're accused of being anti-laïcité. So there has been a complete reversal of the meaning of the term laïcité. Laïcité has been nationalized, and in being nationalized, it has been presented as something that is the opposite of historical laïcité. So the transcendent use of the term as if it were sort of eternally French, just like the term republic, just like the term universalism, etc. All these terms are presented as untranslatable almost. But in fact, that's a way of pretending that it's rooted in French history at the very moment when it's undermining what the history of these terms implies. Now, these are not isolated examples. I will take a few more examples of this way of turning things upside down. There's today, and I will take 3 examples. The first one, which is something that I have been working on in the last months, and in particular, as I co-organized an event in Brazil called the Epidemic of Transphobia, in reaction against people who talk about an epidemic of transgender. And I co-organized a few weeks ago in Paris an international conference where I spoke about this epidemic of transphobia, and it was a conference on trans issues and trans knowledge. Now, why do I talk about that here? What is very striking is that political transphobia, I'm not talking about social transphobia, that is people who don't like trans persons, etc. I'm talking about the political discourse. This is what we're talking about. We're not just talking about social norms, we're talking about political discourses. Transphobia is very often today presented in the name of feminism, and hence the term that has spread internationally, TERFs. Now, of course, personally, I have doubts about the term TERFs because it seems to me that the F word at the end may not fit in the picture, because more and more people who defend transphobic positions, for example, saying this person cannot be a woman, it is a man. The people who say that rely on an essentialist definition of man and woman, a biological definition of man and woman, which is exactly what feminism has been defined against. I mean, we all know Simone de Beauvoir's famous phrase, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Clearly, that doesn't encourage thinking in strictly biological terms. So it seems to me that turning feminism upside down by saying feminism is about the biological essence of women is precisely the opposite of feminism. Let me take another example, definitions of race. I was reading a piece in the New York Times about the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court that is discussing issues of affirmative action on the one hand and the Voting Rights Act on the other. In both cases, we see a new kind of argument that has emerged, which basically says we should be against affirmative action and we should be against all the efforts to be inclusive in terms of voting rights in the name of colorblindness. Now, of course, that's not entirely new, but that means that the famous 1954-55 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation, is now more and more used as a reactionary reference. Instead of saying it encourages racial equality, it's become it encourages colorblindness, which of course historically is not true. It was even used actually in the discussion for Dobbs, that is the decision about the abortion issue in the Supreme Court, with the idea that just like Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 decision was to be undone, in the same way Roe v. Wade was to be undone. So in many ways, there's been a complete reversal that is progressive decisions are presented as reactionary, and it's against reactionary decisions that now more and more people argue in reactionary terms. So there's a complete reversal of rhetoric. Another example, which also has to do with race, is the transformation of the discussion about race in France, but not just in France. More and more anti-racists are accused of being racist. If you speak about race, then you're a racist. And more people argue that the real problem is anti-white racism or reverse racism, which means that if you deny the existence of anti-white racism, then you're a racist, because anti-racism should be colorblind. I'll be happy to expand on this if you will, but this has gained importance, including in the courts. So the rhetoric of reversal, I think, is very important. Now, there's one element that has played a major role in this way of turning things upside down. It's the battle about freedom and freedom of thought. After all, and let's talk about the news, who is now acquiring Twitter? Elon Musk. That is someone who says there should be absolute freedom on Twitter. And in particular, he wants Trump to have his Twitter account restored. Clearly, freedom of thought, freedom of expression has become a reactionary argument. It's not about freedom, it's about hate speech. It's about hate speech on race, on gender, etc., etc. And of course, it is used constantly against academic freedom. In particular, as you know, attacks against academic freedom are in the name of freedom, because academics are supposed to be, they used to be called politically correct, and now they're accused of indulging in cancel culture. So in fact, it's in the name of freedom that people, reactionaries, neo-fascists, combat academic freedom and more generally, the freedom of social movements. It's important because it facilitates alliances with liberals. Many liberals have sided with the critics of cancel culture because they feel, yes, it's in the name of freedom. I'll take one last example. And can I take 3 or 4 more minutes altogether? Is that going to be okay?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. I'll take an example that I have experienced firsthand in some of the attacks that I, but many others, have experienced. Even 10 years ago, I received letters, anonymous letters at home with death threats. And what was interesting first was that it was at home. And so basically people tell me, we know where to find you. But the rhetoric was interesting because they used the image of a leaflet that was handed during the period of the resistance during World War II. So they identified as, the far right identified as the resistance. Now, of course, that's paradoxical because they're neo-Nazis. And so the idea that neo-Nazis should be the resistance against Nazis is slightly paradoxical. But all the vocabulary that has been used, for example, by Marine Le Pen, it's the occupation, which is the word used for World War II, the collaboration, the occupation by Muslims, collaboration with Muslims, resistance against Muslims, and, for example, I've been regularly threatened with having my head shaved or being killed on the day of liberation, as happened for many women who were allegedly collaborators or had slept with the enemy at the end of World War II. So this reversal of rhetoric, I think, is very important because confusion is essential. And this is the last point that I want to make. Turning things upside down is very efficient because in the end, who knows what? It's all very confusing. Confusion is essential to this soft authoritarian or hard authoritarian rhetoric. I have argued, and I will not develop this too much because I just want to take just 2 more minutes, but I have argued that the problem today in political discourse is not so much fake news. Of course, fake news are important, but there's nothing new about fake news. It used to be called propaganda. So it seems to me that lying is part of political discourse. What is relatively new is the fact of saying in French, n'importe quoi. That is, things that have no meaning. And the best translation I have found for this in English is bullshit. And I have argued, and using a legitimate philosophical reference, that of Harry Frankfurt, who wrote a short essay on bullshit, I have argued that it's very different, and I borrow the argument from him, bullshit is very different from fake news. Alternative facts means I don't care about truth. It's not that I'm lying, because if I'm lying, I want you to believe that it's the truth. So I still believe in the importance of truth, even though I'm lying. But bullshit? No, it doesn't matter. It may be true or not, who cares? What matters is that what I'm talking about is interesting, entertaining. And of course, this has to do also with the neoliberal world that we live in, that is entertainment. If we look at the media, saying something that will be exciting, that will be infuriating, the clash, etc. All the culture of the clash that we see on television, for example, that is something that encourages bullshit, because who can check what they're saying, if it's true or not? Or what we've seen is, for example, in France, but not just in France, many newspapers have developed a section that basically tries to rehabilitate the truth, that is against fake news, to sort of have real news. Yes, but basically fake news takes 1 second, undoing fake news takes a day. So basically it's a losing game. And also reality is less exciting than bullshit. And I think that's very important to understand why this today makes our positions difficult, but also why it makes intellectual work so important. And I want to conclude with that. If we agree that in a way bullshit wins, that is, I have argued that there's the Gresham's law of bullshit, that is bad currency replacing good currency, you know, that's the economic law. And so bullshit replaces arguments. Yes, but at the same time, in the face of anti-intellectualism, we have to take seriously, and this is my argument, we have to take seriously the fact that intellectual work matters, even though at times we have doubts, but we have to, because precisely neo-fascists take it seriously. We have to take seriously neo-fascists who take seriously intellectual work. And the proof is in their anti-intellectualism. So it doesn't solve all the problems, but basically my idea is that if they're fighting in anti-intellectual terms, it's because they think it matters. And why do they think it matters? Because they don't want people to think by themselves. They don't want critical thinking in the university, of course, but why? Because you never know, critical thinking can easily spread. In fact, if you look at social movements like Black Lives Matter or like Me Too, clearly it's not just about academia, even though these movements may at times use academic work. So the attacks of Macron against intersectionality, he's right. Of course, it's absurd in many ways, but he's right and they're right. They're right that it matters because, in fact, critical thinking is what works in a democracy. In a democracy, we want citizens who think by themselves. who have critical tools so that they do not accept just what's printed somewhere or what's in the news on Twitter or whatever. We need critical citizens. Neo-fascists don't want that. They want stupid people. They want people to be stupid. So the battle is about this, the battle about anti-intellectualism, which is also a battle of rhetorics, is should we take seriously intellectual work or not? Should we decide that words matter or not? That's what the battle is about, because basically if words matter, that means that I have to try not to use them carelessly. I have to try to be as precise as I can. And of course, for example, we can start having a discussion. Is it appropriate to say authoritarian? Is it appropriate to say neo-fascist? Is it appropriate to say populist, etc.? We're doing our job. We're doing our job, which is to try and use words as best we can. It doesn't mean that I'm using well this term or that term or etc. And we can discuss that. But precisely, it means that we're accepting the idea that words matter because thinking matters. Critical thinking is based on a bet that people desire to be intelligent. That is, they desire to understand the world. Neo-fascism is based on a bet, the suggestion that people desire to be stupid. So it's a political battle about intelligence, which is not whether people are intelligent or not, but politically, what do they desire to be? So we have to convince people that it's more desirable to engage in critical thinking, even though, of course, it complicates matters, even though we may not agree, etc. Yes, we know all that. But after all, thinking that it's better to understand the world than not to understand it is our only hope. Thanks very much for your patience.